Hi class, my name is Misty Martin, and for this week's discussion post, we were to post a sample lecture that we would be presenting in our own classroom. And it would have a controversial edge to it to kind of spark another discussion within it. So, for my discussion topic or my lecture topic, it is the women of the 45. It would be presented to a graduate class, and this would be an elective in European history, as my class is designed to cover the first Jacobite uprising in Scotland of 1715 briefly, and then it would mainly cover the second Jacobite uprising of 45 or 1745 on into closing out the course with the Highland clearances. As I mentioned, my lecture title is the Women of the 45, which is to cover the women who served in the second Jacobite Rising of 1745. And as we get into my lecture, we are going to talk about the Jacobite women. Now, class, as we move from last week's discussions on the Jacobite strategies and structures, we are going to talk about the female Jacobites. So oftentimes I want to ask people what image they have in their head now about what they think a Highland Jacobite would look like. And sometimes people will tell me, oh, that's easy, Jamie Fraser or Sam Heughan from Outlander. Sometimes people will tell me, oh, Mel Gibson from Braveheart. Okay. And if you do have knowledge of women having been in the Jacobite Rebellion, you might tell me Flora MacDonald. Okay, awesome. All of these are great answers. And it is when you don't tell me that there was a woman involved that I have to beg the question is where are we missing the cues? And I think it wasn't until recently that women's involvement in these earlier wars were coming to light. And it wasn't that they were just lack of recording or lack of primary evidence, it's just that they weren't talked about enough. Um, when we really dive into it, though, it's that we now acknowledge this, but let's find out why. Why were these women involved? Who were they? What were their stories? What were they doing? So, how do they differ from these men? So, if we really kind of hone in, one, Mel Gibson was not involved in the Jacobite Rising, but he was a Highlander. That was kind of based on that. But let's kind of look at how different they were to these male images that we keep bringing up in our head and kind of just look at how the differences are in such an exciting topic. So, when we really break down the women's roles and their motives, a lot of times historians want to say that it's the attractiveness of Bonnie Prince Charlie. And some will say, oh, okay, we really mean the theoretical or like the actual attractiveness, the Bonniness of Prince Charles Edward Stuart. And as we go through the historiography, that has then been debunked and said that's actually an over exaggeration. He really wasn't that beautiful. And then some people will say, well, actually, it was the overall appeal and the attractiveness that all of the Highlanders, all of the Jacobites felt. And throughout history, we have seen people who actually felt that he was just overall attractive and the appeal was almost comparative to Robert the Bruce. However, really, when you dive into this, the women had such loyalty to their family that it's more likely that they felt a call to the cause because of that family loyalty. And what I mean when I say this is that if their fathers, their brothers, if they didn't have those, or their husband were exiled, were dead, they kind of felt obligated to then step up to the cause. And we're talking about a war or this long, really like obligation that spanned many, many years. So this Stuart dynasty or the Stuart fight for this throne spanned back into the 1600s. So that is something that really you have to consider when you think of maybe that was really their motive. And then when you look at the poorer women, they felt this was an opportunity to show that clan loyalty. And again, you're talking about the Highlands of Scotland. They're so remote, so out in the middle of nowhere that they really had to show their support. So they felt this as, I really don't have anything. What do I have to lose? Let me show my support by joining in on this clan loyalty. Because again, what do I have to lose? I don't have anything else. So with that said, let's dive into who the women were. And we're not talking about just Flora McDonald, because again, as I've spoken about, Miss Flora McDonald came later. Um, I take that back. Let me backtrack. So we know the motives. We will get to Miss Flora and the other ladies, but we're not how did they contribute? Okay, we do know that they did not just pick up a weapon and march to Culloden. Okay, these women were amazing. They rallied troops, they recruited, they they contributed before the war, they hid soldiers after the war, they kind of raised funds. So they weren't just picking up a weapon. And if you do actually look at a lot of the paintings and a lot of the descriptions, there were not really records of women actually on the battlefield. So I do think that that is also something to take into consideration. So when we think of this, like, oh, were there really women on the battlefield? No, there really weren't, but they're still considered female Jacobites. I'm not saying that there are not women that did not go out there. I am just saying that historically you can still be a Jacobite woman and not have gone out into the battlefield. So, with that said, now let's go on to these famous and gallant women. First, I want to discuss Miss Jane Cameron. So, Miss Jane Cameron's story is just, it's amazing. And sometimes, as the evidence has come out, it's really hard to kind of depict what was fact and what was fiction because there was Miss Jean Cameron, and then there was her almost her alter ego that the British had really kind of put into character, which was Miss Jenny Cameron. Miss Jenny Cameron was the British's propaganda. And so they had dressed up Miss Jenny Cameron in full tartan regalia and said, hey, this is Jenny Cameron. She is a male. She is the opposite of what you really want to be. She's not virtuous. She is promiscuous. And there were songs written about her, just the opposite of what a female should be behaving like during this time. And Jenny Cameron represented what the British wanted everyone to see the female Jacobites to be. And whether that was true or not, that was how they were portraying the female Jacobites. There were also rumors as to female Jacobites being in cahoots or in this negative behavior with Bonnie Prince Charlie. And so there was a lot of that going on. None of that, however, was confirmed. But again, that was historically what was being told. So we have Miss Jean Cameron, who again was a very interesting individual and the center of unfortunate British propaganda. Then we have Miss Lady Anne Mackintosh. So she was from a family of strong Jacobite supporters, and she married into the Mackintosh clan. So the Mackintosh clan, however, were pro-Hanoverian. So her husband, Mr. Angus Mackintosh, enlisted into the Black Watch, where he then joined the pro-Hanoverian ranks. And this Miss Anne Mackintosh, Lady Anne, she orchestrated this event or this takedown where in the middle of the night she was trying to avoid um Bonnie Prince Charlie kind of taking over or taking being caught in Inverness or trying to take over Inverness. And what had happened is she had nothing. She had no soldiers at her control. And so she kind of pulled a fast one on the English soldiers where her husband was. And so in the middle of the woods, she told them they were about to be ambushed. And what had happened is that she gave the Jacobites the ability to ambush her husband's platoon or their regiment at that time. And so there ended up being this nickname that came out where her husband was a captain, and so there was an exchange of words that are said is that she said, "You're in good hands, Captain," and he said, you are as well, Colonel. And so that was where she got the nickname Colonel Anne. Also we have Anne McKay. So Anne McKay, after the Battle of Culloden, had been recorded in um, Reverend Robert's diary, or sorry, his papers of a lion in mourning. And so she was told to have been harboring a an escapee from Culloden, or a soldier from Culloden. And what had happened is when she was caught, um, she ended up being almost like a torture, which we'll get to in a moment. But she is also an important figure for kind of harboring individuals after Culloden. And then we also have Miss Flora MacDonald. So Miss Flora MacDonald, as we know, was taking part in helping with the escape of Bonnie Prince Charlie. So she orchestrated that whole escape, and it's a fascinating thing on the Isle of Skye. So she had dressed Bonnie Prince Charlie up, and after a few days, he was able to escape through the Outer Hebrides, and then someone amongst them had turned her in. So, getting to the controversial part, and this is my favorite part to talk about because we want to discuss how the women were treated differently than males after their capture. So, a lot of the men after Culloden were obviously either exiled or they were just murdered. The women, unfortunately, were not. So, when we look at specifically Lady Mackintosh, so Lady Mackintosh was actually held very respectfully because her husband was a Hanoverian soldier. And then we have Miss Flora MacDonald. So Miss Flora MacDonald was actually made into a celebrity. She faced 1 year in prison. So she bounced from prison to prison, eventually being in the Tower of London. Um, Again, she was made into a celebrity. She was never tried, released in July of 1747. And then we have Anne McKay. So Anne McKay actually was sentenced to lashings. However, Miss Lady, um, Miss Lady Anne Mackintosh utilized her stature and her privilege to reduce Miss Anne McKay's lashings down. So she never actually received her lashings. However, Anne McKay did stand for 3 days to where she was so fatigued. So these are all things that were really fascinating when you look at it. But even with Jean Cameron, so Jean Cameron was made a laughingstock amongst the British, but none of these women who are recorded were murdered or killed or exiled. So it's really fascinating when you break down how the women amongst the Jacobite that we've talked about or that are recorded were handled versus the males that were um, handled at the Battle of Culloden. So, again, thank you guys all for listening, and I will see you all next week.